"Sir, can you help fix our window? Mom's scared and me too." The young girl's voice pierced the heavy silence of the Chicago midnight like a flare in a dark sky, halting a man who had spent a lifetime making sure the world kept its distance. Jai-Ho had just turned the heavy deadbolt of his penthouse when the soft, rhythmic thumping of footsteps echoed in the hallway, and 6-year-old Nia appeared like a ghost in the dim light. She stood squarely in his path, her braided hair adorned with bright pink bows that glowed under the flickering hallway bulb, her white Sunday dress a sharp, clean contrast to the grime of the apartment block. Behind her, the shadows of their dilapidated unit loomed, where Jessica stood frozen in the doorway, her breath catching in her throat. But Nia didn't move. She had already planted herself firmly in front of a man whose ink-stained neck and cold, attentive gaze caused even the most hardened street bosses to lower their eyes. Nia looked up at him with the fearless curiosity of a child, utterly blind to the social hierarchies of the city or the blood-soaked reputation that made their entire neighborhood whisper his name in fear. "Hello, family. Having smart kids is a blessing. Sometimes they learn from our behaviors, kind gestures, and how we relate to people. Sit tight and listen. Do not skip yet. Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comment so I can send you special regards for being part of this family. And also, hit the subscribe button on your screen to subscribe to this channel. Now let's go deep into this story." The heavy, pressurized silence of the hallway shifted into the cramped confines of apartment 4B as Jai-Ho stepped over the threshold. He didn't wait for an invitation. The urgency of the shattered glass in the kitchen demanded an immediate, cold efficiency. Jessica stood by the laminate counter, her hands trembling as she clutched a kitchen towel, her eyes darting between the jagged hole in the pane and the man now standing in her sanctuary. Jai-Ho moved with a predatory grace that made the small kitchen feel even smaller. He set a heavy, matte black leather case on the table. When the latches clicked open, Jessica caught a glimpse of the contents: high-tensile wire, precision pliers, and a set of specialized glass cutters that looked more like surgical instruments than hardware store tools. These were instruments designed for silent entries and forced extractions, tools that usually facilitated the interrogations the neighborhood whispered about. But tonight, they were being repurposed for a rare act of restoration. "You don't have to do this," Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible over the whistle of the Chicago wind whipping through the gap. "The landlord said he'd get to it by Monday." Jai-Ho didn't look up. He was already measuring the frame with a focused, terrifying intensity. "Monday is 3 days away," he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated in the small room. "The wind is cold, and the people in this city are colder. You shouldn't be exposed." He worked in a vacuum of sound. With a pair of reinforced gloves, he began extracting the shards of glass, his movements so controlled they were almost rhythmic. There was no wasted motion, no clumsy fumbling. Jessica watched, mesmerized by the sight of his tattooed forearms, a map of a violent life, moving with such delicate precision. Nia sat at the small dinette set, her chin resting on her palms, watching him like he was a magician performing a dark, necessary spell. The midnight glass was fitted into place with a satisfying, airtight click. Jai-Ho applied a bead of industrial sealant with the steady hand of a marksman. In 20 minutes, he had done what the building's maintenance had neglected for months. As he packed his kit, the silence returned, but it was no longer heavy with fear. It was weighted with a strange, burgeoning debt. He turned to the door, pausing only when Nia reached out and touched the sleeve of his white button-down. "Is the window strong now?" she asked. Jai-Ho looked down at the girl, his expression unreadable, though the tension in his jaw softened just a fraction. "Nothing is getting through that window tonight, little one." He glanced at Jessica, a silent acknowledgement of the fear he had just erased, before disappearing back into the shadows of the hallway as quietly as a ghost. The following week, The Chicago winter sharpened its teeth, but it wasn't the cold that kept Jessica's nerves frayed. It was the three young men who had taken to loitering in the dim stairwell of the third floor, their voices a low, jagged rumble that cut out every time she hurried past with Nia. They were local muscle for a neighborhood crew, marked by bravado and the restless energy of those looking for a target. On Tuesday, one had reached out a hand blocking Jessica's path as he blew a plume of smoke into the air. He hadn't said much, just a suggestive comment about her fancy new window, but the implication was a heavy stone in her stomach. She hadn't told Jai-ho. She didn't want to owe him more than she already did, and she certainly didn't want to invite his brand of violence into her life. But Jai-ho lived in the pulse of the building. He didn't need to be told to know when the atmosphere turned predatory. On Wednesday morning, the stairwell was suddenly clear of the loiterers, replaced by a different kind of presence. As Jessica stepped out to take Nia to daycare, she nearly bumped into a man in a navy blue jumpsuit. He was middle-aged, with a thick neck and a clipboard, meticulously checking the wiring of a hallway light fixture. He looked like any other city contractor, yet there was a stillness about him, a military precision in the way he stood that didn't quite match the typical sluggishness of building maintenance. "Morning, ma'am," he said, his voice flat and professional. He didn't look at her, but he shifted his stance just enough to provide a clear path for her and Nia. By the time she returned that afternoon, there was another man on the fourth floor. He was crouching near the elevator bank, a toolbox open beside him as he worked on the floor molding. Like the man from the morning, he wore the standard-issue blue uniform, but his eyes were constantly moving, scanning the hallway with a rhythmic, mechanical cadence. When the group of young men from the third floor wandered up, looking for trouble, the man with the toolbox didn't shout or threaten. He simply stood up. He didn't say a word, but he adjusted his tool belt, revealing the briefest glimpse of a heavy, black radio and a silhouette beneath his jacket that suggested he was carrying far more than just a hammer. The boys vanished within seconds, retreating to the street as if they had seen a ghost. Jessica stood at her door, her key trembling in the lock. She looked down the hall at the maintenance worker. "Who sent you?" she asked, her voice a fragile thread. The man didn't offer a name. He simply nodded toward the end of the hall, toward the heavy, silent door of the penthouse. "Just making sure the infrastructure is sound, Ms. Reed. Orders are to stay until the foundation is secure." She realized then that Jai-ho hadn't just fixed a window, he had extended his perimeter. He had turned her hallway into a fortified corridor, staffed by men who were ghosts in the machinery of the city. He was shielding her with a human wall, disguised as the very help the city had always denied her. That night, for the first time in months, Jessica didn't push the heavy dresser in front of the door. She sat on the edge of her bed, listening to the muffled, rhythmic footsteps of the man in the hallway, the silent watchman, and finally let her shoulders drop. The fear wasn't gone, but it had been held at bay by a man who understood that sometimes the only way to protect the innocent was to surround them with shadows. The darkness that descended upon Chicago was absolute, a sudden and violent fracture in the city's electric pulse. A transformer had blown 3 blocks over, plunging the neighborhood into a winter gloom so thick it felt tangible. Inside apartment 4B, the cold began to seep through the floorboards almost immediately, but it wasn't the temperature that sent a chill through Jessica's blood. It was the sound of Nia's breathing, a ragged, wet wheeze that rattled in the small girl's chest. Jessica pressed the back of her hand to Nia's forehead and gasped. The heat was terrifying, a dry, radiating fire that seemed to consume the child's small frame. In the flickering orange glow of a single emergency candle, Nia's eyes were glassy, her pink bows lopsided as she tossed in a restless, feverish delirium. Jessica reached for her phone, but the screen remained black, the local towers overwhelmed or dead. The streets below were a chaos of sirens and shadows, and the walk to the nearest clinic in this weather, in this dark, felt like a death sentence. A heavy, rhythmic knock thudded against the door. It wasn't the tentative tap of a neighbor, but the solid, grounded strike of someone who owned the silence. When Jessica opened the door, Jai-ho was there, backlit by the beam of a high-powered tactical flashlight held by one of his silent sentries. He didn't ask for permission. He saw the candle, saw the panic etched into the lines of Jessica's face, and his gaze immediately shifted to the bed. "She's burning up," Jessica choked out, her voice fraying. "I can't call out. I can't get her to the hospital." Jai-ho stepped into the room, his presence instantly stabilizing the frantic air. "The hospitals will be a war zone tonight. Power is out across 6 wards. He turned to the man in the hallway and spoke a single word in a language Jessica didn't understand, sharp and commanding. 10 minutes later, a man appeared who did not look like a city doctor. He wore a heavy wool overcoat over a dark suit, carrying a pressurized silver medical case that looked like it belonged in a high-security lab. He was a fixer for the syndicate, a surgeon who operated in the spaces between the law, usually stitching up gunshot wounds in basement clinics. But as he knelt by Nia's bed, his hands were incredibly gentle. Under Jai-ho's watchful, iron-still silhouette, the doctor administered a specialized nebulizer powered by a portable battery pack and an intravenous cooling saline. He moved with a clinical detachment that whispered of high-stakes experience, his every movement dictated by the silent man standing in the corner. As the rattle in Nia's chest began to smooth into a steady rhythm and the heat left her skin, Jessica sank into a chair, her strength finally giving way. She looked at Jai-ho, who was leaning against the window frame he had repaired a week ago, his tattooed hand resting on the hilt of his flashlight. "Who is he?" she whispered, nodding toward the doctor who was now packing his specialized, unmarked vials. "A man who owes me his life," Jai-ho replied, his eyes fixed on the sleeping child. "Tonight, he's just a doctor." Jessica realized then that the dark resources Jai-ho commanded, the secret doctors, the untraceable equipment, the men who moved in shadows, were not just instruments of fear. In his hands, they were a private infrastructure of survival. He had brought the forbidden world to her doorstep not to harm, but to provide a sanctuary that the city's light had failed to give. For the first time, the man with the ink on his neck didn't look like a monster. He looked like the only light left in the blackout. The fluorescent lights of the City Hall hearing room hummed with a sterile, bureaucratic indifference that felt miles away from the cold reality of the streets. Jessica sat in the 3rd row, her fingers white-knuckled around the strap of her purse. At the front of the room, a representative from Sterling Heights Development, a man in a sharp suit with a voice like polished glass, was presenting a map of the neighborhood. Her apartment complex was highlighted in a clinical, antiseptic red. "Economic revitalization," he called it. To Jessica, it looked like a target. The council members nodded along, their eyes glazed with the boredom of a foregone conclusion. The landlord had already stopped taking her calls, and the legal aid office had warned her that without a miracle, the eviction notices would be taped to their doors by Friday. She felt small in the high-ceilinged room, a single mother whose life was being reduced to a footnote in a quarterly earnings report. The heavy oak doors at the back of the hall swung open. The sound shouldn't have been loud, but the room fell silent as if the oxygen had been sucked out of it. Jai-ho walked down the center aisle. He wasn't wearing his usual white button-down. Today, he was draped in a tailored black overcoat that made him look like a shadow given form. He didn't have a briefcase, and he didn't have a lawyer. He moved with a heavy, deliberate stride, his neck tattoos visible above his collar, a silent reminder of the world that existed outside these sterile walls. He didn't take a seat. He walked straight to the railing, his presence a dark anchor in the room. The developer's representative faltered mid-sentence, his rehearsed smile twitching. He recognized Jai-ho. Everyone in the city's upper echelons knew the man who controlled the docks and the silent movements of the Chicago night. Jai-ho didn't look at the council. He turned his head slightly to look at the developer. The silence stretched, becoming agonizing. It wasn't a threat, not a verbal one anyway, but the air in the room grew cold. It was the look of a man who knew exactly which offshore accounts the developer used and where his children went to school. "The 4th Street project," Jai-ho said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate the floorboards. "It has come to my attention that the residency status of the current tenants is being mismanaged." The head of the city council cleared his throat, his face suddenly pale. "Mr. Gallo, Mr. Jai-ho, we were just discussing the benefits of the new." "The benefit," Jai-ho interrupted, his eyes never leaving the developer, "is instability. The families in that building are under my personal observation. Any attempt to displace them would be viewed as a personal grievance." The developer swallowed hard, his polished glass voice cracking. "There may have been an administrative error in the filing. We haven't fully assessed the historical value of the existing structure." The shift was instantaneous. The red revitalization zone on the map suddenly felt like a liability. Within 10 minutes, the council moved to table the motion indefinitely, citing the need for further community impact studies. The developer fled the room before the gavel even hit the sound block. Jai-ho turned and began his exit, his coat billowing behind him. As he passed Jessica's row, he didn't stop, but his pace slowed for a fraction of a second. His dark eyes met hers, no longer the cold gaze of a boss, but the steady, protective look of the man who had fixed her window. "Go home, Jessica," he murmured, so low only she could hear. "Your door is still locked, and it will stay that way." She watched him walk out, the doors swinging shut behind him. The miracle had arrived, not in the form of a legal brief or a silver-tongued advocate, but in the shadow of a man who had decided that one small corner of the city was no longer for sale. For the first time, Jessica realized that while she feared his world, it was the only thing powerful enough to keep the rest of the world from devouring hers. The following Saturday, the fierce Chicago winds had died down to a biting, crystalline cold, leaving the apartment building in a rare state of quiet. Inside apartment 4B, however, a different kind of struggle was unfolding. Jessica sat on the edge of the sofa, a comb in one hand and a spray bottle in the other, her shoulders slumped in defeat. Her hands, usually so capable, were stiff with a flare-up of carpal tunnel from double shifts at the diner, and Nia was fidgeting, her hair half unraveled from the week's braids. "I can do it, Mommy," Nia chirped, though her small fingers only tangled the strands further. A knock, light but deliberate, sounded at the door. Jessica didn't even have to look through the peephole anymore. She recognized the rhythm. When she opened the door, Jai-ho stood there, holding a small white box from the bakery downstairs. He took one look at Jessica's swollen wrists and then at Nia's wild halo of curls. Without a word, he set the box on the table and removed his heavy overcoat, draping it over the back of a chair. He rolled up his sleeves, revealing the intricate black ink that spiraled down to his wrists, dragons and shadows that had seen more blood than kindness. "Sit," he said to Nia, gesturing to the low stool. Jessica blinked, her voice caught in her throat. "Jai-ho, it's complicated. You have to section it, and the tension has to be just right, or it hurts." Jai-ho didn't answer immediately. He picked up the wide-tooth comb with a surprising delicacy. "My sister," he said, his voice lower than usual, thick with a memory he rarely touched. "In the camps before we came here, my mother was gone. I spent 2 years practicing on her so the others wouldn't see her as a target for being unkempt. A girl who is cared for looks like she has a protector. It keeps the wolves away." Jessica watched, her breath hitching, as the man the city feared knelt on the linoleum floor. His large, scarred hands moved with a rhythmic, mesmerizing grace. He didn't fumble. He parted the hair with the precision of a man who dealt in millimeters, his tattooed fingers weaving the dark strands into neat, tight rows. The sight was a physical blow to Jessica's defenses. She had prepared herself for his violence. She had even prepared herself for his protection. But she had not prepared for this, the sight of a lethal man using his strength to be gentle. There was no hidden cost in the way he tucked a stray hair behind Nia's ear. There was no debt being calculated in the way he reached into the basket on the table and instinctively chose the pink bows to match Nia's dress. Nia sat perfectly still, sensing the gravity of the moment. "You're good at this, Mr. Jaiho," she whispered. "Focus on your story, Nia," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the task. Jessica leaned against the doorframe, her eyes stinging. For years, she had carried the weight of being Nia's entire world, the provider, the fixer, the braider of hair. She had built a fortress around her heart, convinced that any hand extended toward them would eventually turn into a fist. But as she watched Jaiho finish the last braid and carefully snap the pink bow into place, the last brick of her hyper-independence crumbled. He stood up, his task finished, and looked at Jessica. For the first time, the coldness in his eyes was entirely gone, replaced by a raw, quiet vulnerability that mirrored her own. He wasn't just a neighbor or a boss anymore. In the simple act of braiding a little girl's hair, he had moved from the hallway into the very center of their lives. "There," Jaiho said, stepping back. "She's ready for the world." Jessica couldn't find the words to thank him, so she simply reached out, her hand hovering near his inked forearm before she finally let her fingers rest against his skin. It was the first time she had touched him by choice, and as his skin warmed hers, she realized that the window wasn't the only thing he had repaired. He was stitching her back together, one silent act of grace at a time. The peace that had settled over the fourth floor was a fragile thing, shattered on a Tuesday night by a sound that didn't belong in a home, the sharp, metallic slide of a suppressed firearm racking in the stairwell. Jaiho had been sitting in his darkened living room, the blueprints for a legitimate community land trust spread across his table, when his internal alarm, honed by decades of survival, spiked. He was in the hallway before the elevator doors even hummed. His sentries, the men in the blue maintenance jumpsuits, were already in position, but the intruders weren't local street thugs this time. These were the ghosts of the syndicate Jaiho was trying to leave behind, men sent by his former associates who viewed his retirement and newfound philanthropy as a sign of terminal weakness. "Jaiho," a voice hissed from the shadows of the stairwell. It was Minkayu, a man who had once been his right hand, now a predator sensing an opening. "The elders don't like that you've grown fond of the dirt. They think your heart has gone soft for a waitress and a child with pink bows." Jaiho stood in the center of the hallway, a monolithic figure in the dim light. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't have to. The air around him surged with a cold, lethal authority that had nothing to do with tools or hardware. "Whatever you think you're here for, Minkayu, you're mistaken. This floor is no longer part of the territory." "Everything is territory," Minkayu countered, stepping into the light, the barrel of his weapon glinting. "Unless you remind us why we feared you." Jessica's door was only 10 feet away. Inside, she and Nia were likely sleeping, unaware that the wolf was no longer at the door, but had stepped into the foyer. Jaiho felt a heat in his chest he hadn't felt in years, not the hot rage of a young soldier, but the cold, protective fire of a father. He realized then that he couldn't simply walk away. To keep the neighbors safe, to ensure that Nia never woke up to the sound of breaking glass again, he had to exorcise these ghosts with the only language they understood. He moved with a speed that defied his athletic frame. It wasn't a brawl, it was a surgical removal. Jaiho closed the distance before Minkayu could level his aim, his tattooed hand locking around the man's wrist with the force of a hydraulic press. There was a sickening crack of bone, a muffled groan, and then Jai-ho had the man pinned against the brickwork of the stairwell. "Go back," Jai-ho whispered, his voice a low, terrifying vibration against Minkayu's ear. "Tell them that I haven't gone soft. Tell them I found something worth killing for. If a single one of your shadows crosses the street toward this building again, I won't just leave the syndicate. I'll bury it." He didn't kill them. To kill them here would stain the sanctuary he was building for Jessica. Instead, he systematically disarmed and dismantled the three-man hit squad, his movements a blur of practiced violence that ended with them retreating into the night, broken and terrified. When the hallway was silent again, Jai-ho leaned his forehead against the cool brick, his breath hitching. His knuckles were split, and the ghosts were gone for now, but the weight of his past felt heavier than ever. He walked to Jessica's door and placed a hand against the wood. He didn't knock. He just stood there, the silent watchman once more, knowing he would have to descend into the darkness one last time to ensure they could stay in the light. He had fought for power his whole life. Tonight, for the first time, he had fought for peace. The transition began not with a grand announcement, but with the systematic silencing of the violence that had defined Jai-ho's life. For weeks, the penthouse had been a hive of activity, but the visitors were no longer men with cold eyes and hidden holsters. Instead, architects, urban planners, and forensic accountants moved through the halls, their leather satchels filled with blueprints and tax filings rather than the ledgers of the underground. Jai-ho sat at the head of his mahogany table, his sleeves rolled up to reveal his tattoos, but his focus was entirely on the legal frameworks of a massive community investment trust. He was dismantling a kingdom of shadows to build a foundation of light. It was a dangerous gamble. In his world, legitimacy was often viewed as a surrender, and surrender usually invited a bullet. But every time he looked at the jagged scar on his knuckle from the night in the stairwell, he was reminded that he could no longer live in the gray spaces if he wanted to bring Jessica and Nia into his son. Jessica noticed the change in the atmosphere of the building first. The maintenance crew had been replaced by actual contractors who were busy repainting the communal areas and installing high-grade energy-efficient windows throughout the block. When she ran into Jai-ho in the lobby, he wasn't surrounded by his usual phalanx of silent sentries. He was alone, holding a stack of permits and a coffee from the corner shop she frequented. "You look different," she said, pausing by the new brass mailboxes. "Less like you're waiting for a war." Jai-ho leaned against the wall, a tired but genuine smile touching his lips. "I'm learning that filing paperwork is more exhausting than holding a perimeter. It turns out, building something that lasts requires more signatures than I anticipated." He invited her up to his office that evening, a space she had once viewed as a fortress of secrets. Now, the heavy drapes were pulled back, allowing the amber glow of the Chicago skyline to fill the room. He showed her the plans for the Reed Gallo Foundation, a nonprofit designed to buy up neglected properties and lock them into affordable housing trusts. He had named the first project after her. "I'm divesting from the docks, Jessica. Everything I own is being moved into clean holdings," he explained, his voice steady. "I don't want Nia to grow up in a world where her father has to hide his hands. I want her to know that the man who fixed her window is the same man who made sure her neighbors never have to worry about an eviction notice again." The weight of his confession hung in the air, thick with the risk he was taking. By going legit, he was stripping away his armor and making himself a target for his old rivals and the law alike. He was doing it for a future that wasn't guaranteed, a future where he could walk Nia to school without scanning the rooftops. Jessica walked over to the desk, looking at the documents that represented his transformation. She saw the different kind of boss he was becoming, a man who used his power not to dominate, but to empower. She realized that he wasn't just fixing a building, he was fixing a broken legacy. "It's dangerous, isn't it?" she asked softly, placing her hand over his on the desk. Everything worth having is, Jai-ho replied, turning his hand to interlace his fingers with hers. But for the first time in my life, I'm not fighting for territory. I'm fighting for a home, and I want you and Nia to be the heart of it. In that moment, the tattoos on his arms didn't look like marks of a criminal past. They looked like the history of a man who had finally found something worth the struggle of change. He was no longer the mafia boss next door. He was a partner in a new, uncertain, and beautiful beginning. The legal finality of Jai-ho's transformation arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, carried in a simple manila envelope that seemed too light for the weight of the security it contained. The Chicago winter was finally beginning to lose its grip, patches of gray slush melting into the pavement, but the air inside apartment 4B was warm, filled with the scent of the dinner Jessica was preparing and the quiet hum of Nia humming to herself as she colored at the table. When Jai-ho arrived, he didn't have the heavy presence of a man coming to fix a problem. He looked settled, his posture relaxed in a way Jessica had never seen. He sat at the small kitchen table, moving Nia's crayons aside to make room for the document he slid across the laminate surface. The developer officially walked away this morning, Jai-ho said, his voice quiet but resonant. The holding company that owned this building and the 3 adjacent lots has been liquidated. I bought the debt, Jessica, all of it. Jessica wiped her hands on her apron, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked down at the paper. It was a property deed, but her name was the one listed as the primary trustee for the newly formed Community Land Trust. I don't understand, she whispered, her eyes blurring as she scanned the legal jargon. Jai-ho, this is the whole block. This is millions of dollars. It's more than dollars, he countered, standing up and walking around the table to stand beside her. He pointed to a specific clause in the deed. This ensures that the rent can never exceed 30% of the neighborhood's median income. It means the windows will stay fixed, the hallways will stay lit, and no one can ever buy your home out from under you again. You aren't just a tenant anymore, Jessica. You're the director of the trust. You decide who stays. You decide how this community grows. Jessica felt the breath leave her lungs. For years, her life had been a series of fragile defenses, bracing against the wind, bracing against the landlord, bracing against the fear of a knock at the door that meant they had nowhere to go. With a single signature, Jai-ho hadn't just given her a gift. He had handed her the shield she had been trying to build for herself. Why me? She asked, looking up at him. Jai-ho reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that still felt like a miracle. Because you were the only one who didn't run when I was just a shadow in the hallway. Because you cared for this place when it was falling apart. And because, he paused, his gaze shifting to Nia, who was now watching them with wide, knowing eyes. I want you to know what it feels like to own the ground you stand on. I want to make sure that, when you lock your door at night, it's because you want privacy, not because you're afraid of what's on the other side. Nia hopped off her stool and ran to Jai-ho, wrapping her arms around his leg. Does this mean we don't have to move, Mr. Jai-ho? He knelt, bringing himself level with the child, his tattooed hands resting gently on her shoulders. It means this is your castle, Nia, and nobody, not the landlord, not the city, not even the wind, can take it away from you. The community trust was more than a legal entity. It was the final repair. As Jessica looked at the deed, she realized the survivalist isolation she had worn like armor was finally gone. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was rooted. The man who had started as a terrifying neighbor at midnight had ended by giving her the one thing she thought was impossible in Chicago, a permanent, unshakable peace. She realized then that she would never have to be scared of a door again, because the man who held the key was the same man who had promised to protect the heart of the home. The Chicago morning was crisp, the air smelling of fresh rain and new beginnings rather than the heavy, metallic scent of the city's industrial exhaust. It was the first day of the school year, a milestone that felt like the closing of one book and the opening of a much larger, brighter volume. In the foyer of their building, no longer a place of peeling paint and broken locks, but a bright, secure sanctuary, Nia stood ready. She wore a crisp navy jumper and a brand-new backpack that looked nearly as big as she was, but her most important accessory remained the two perfectly symmetrical pink bows in her hair. Jessica smoothed the front of Nia's dress, her hands steady and free of the tremors that had once haunted her. She looked up as Jai-ho stepped out of the elevator. He was dressed simply in a charcoal sweater and dark slacks, his tattoos hidden beneath the fabric, but the strength they represented was visible in the way he carried himself. He wasn't the monster of Chicago anymore. He was a man who had successfully navigated the treacherous path to legitimacy, his business now centered on the very community he once lived beside. As they stepped onto the sidewalk, Nia didn't hesitate. She reached out her left hand for Jessica and her right for Jai-ho. They walked down the street, a small, unbreakable line against the backdrop of the waking city. Jessica felt a lump in her throat as she watched Nia swing their hands, her small boots clicking against the pavement with a confidence that had been earned through months of quiet security. "Are you nervous, little one?" Jai-ho asked, his voice a warm rumble that Nia always leaned toward. "No," Nia said, looking up at him with the same directness she'd had the night she asked him to fix their window. "Because you're coming to pick me up, right?" "Right on time," Jai-ho promised, and the gravity in his tone made it clear that this was a vow more sacred than any he'd ever made in his previous life. When they reached the school gates, the scene was a chaotic blur of parents and children, but Jessica felt a profound sense of peace. She saw the way other parents looked at them, not with the fear she had expected, but with a simple, nodding recognition. They were just another family. Jai-ho leaned down, and Nia threw her arms around his neck, whispering something into his ear that made the hardened lines of his face dissolve into a look of pure, unadulterated pride. As Nia ran toward her classroom, pausing only to give one last, enthusiastic wave, Jessica felt Jai-ho's arms slide around her waist. She leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. The journey from that midnight knock to this sunlit morning had been paved with broken glass, dangerous debts, and a slow, difficult trust. But as they stood together watching their daughter start her new life, Jessica realized that Jai-ho had fulfilled his promise 10 times over. He hadn't just fixed a window or a door. He had fixed the broken sense of hope that Jessica had carried like a weight for years. He had chosen them, and in doing so, he had allowed them to choose him back. As they turned to walk back toward the home they had built together, the Mafia boss and the waitress were gone, replaced by two people who had found that the most powerful force in the city wasn't fear or money. It was the quiet, steady choice to be a family. The end. If you love this story, kindly subscribe to this channel and leave a like for us.